So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the historical custodians of these lands, this place which we're gathered on right now. And to pay attention to the weight of the people and events that the passage of time allows us to render invisible. Yeah. Okay. Grounds. You're generally supposed to begin this sort of thing with a joke or an anecdote or something like that. You know, it makes you relatable and gets the audience on your side. I personally think just bribery would be better, but I can't afford that, so. I'm not a social scientist, but I reckon there's enough empirical evidence to suggest that it's probably in your best interest and mine if I don't try to tell a joke. Even though I think I am due a laugh any day now. So instead, I could start with an anecdote, but I've got a lot of stories in store for you already. In fact, my plan is to tell a series of interweaving, interconnected stories and ask you to help me to think them through. I'm basically getting you to help me do my homework. I'm genuinely stuck on the question of movement, possibility, and liberty. And a country that includes a phrase like the land of the free in its national anthem seems like a reasonable place to go in search of answers to the question of freedom. I'm especially drawn to the fact that the anthem was penned by a lawyer and then set to the tune of a British song, against whom said lawyer and others were asserting their freedom. You know, I find the complexity and even the contradictions in that fascinating and appealing. Okay, but I digress. I need to get started. I've ruled out a joke. I'm already telling you a bunch of stories. So how about a game? What if we played a word association game? What if I said, I'm going to say the word Africa and ask you to shout out the first things that come to mind? Don't actually do that. Past experience has taught me that that might not be the smartest thing to do. And I'm not sure which is scarier, when you've got really, really polite audiences that lie and say what they think you want to hear, or really, really not self-conscious audiences who say the first thing that actually does come to mind. In either case, I think, let's not do that. Instead, let's not do that. Instead, let's pretend. Like philosophers, we like thought experiments, yeah? So how about we pretend that I asked you to shout out the first thing that comes to mind when I say Africa? Yeah, and then I can maintain this godlike status where I can tell you what you would have said in response. Let's do that. Yeah? Let's imagine I asked the question and you lot responded. In Australia, we keep hearing about these liberal North American institutions and how liberal the universities have become. And so, because you're a liberal progressive bunch, I'm going to imagine that your answers to what comes to mind following Africa would be something like the Middle Passage, cultural and linguistic diversity, abundant human and natural resources, digital innovation, Marcus Garvey, Fela Kuti, Miriam Makeba, Buchie Mecheta, Maya Angelou, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Titidanga Rembwa, Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, but that's not actually credible. Maybe I'm taking it too far. Maybe a more credible list of things that you might have said, a more credible list of things you might associate with Africa, could be Nelson Mandela, everybody loves Madiba, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Lupita Nyong'o, the Nigeria, Wakanda Forever, and African proverbs. Yeah? It takes a village to raise a child. I am because we are. Yeah. And the moment someone said I am because we are, I would have stopped you. I said, okay, stop. Let's think about that. Let's use that as our entry into this conversation. Okay, so that's my starting point. My imaginary game got us to I am because we are, and that's my point of entry. So, a Google search of the phrase, I am because we are, is liable to leave one somewhat puzzled. You'd be forgiven for believing that those 5 words both encapsulate African philosophy, or at least the presentable face for precarious African ethos, Ubuntu, embodied by Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. You might also be forgiven for thinking that the adage is inextricably tied to Madonna, not the religious figure, the pop star. Follow a few links from that initial Google search, and one comes to the following précis on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm sorry for the text, but it's gold. We couldn't leave any of it out. Rotten Tomato has this to say about Madonna's film. In the African nation of Malawi, disease, poverty, and famine have taken a horrible toll, especially on young people. In a country of 12 million people, 1 million are orphan children. In 2006, pop singer Madonna began studying the crisis in Malawi and decided to use her wealth and celebrity to help. She helped finance the construction of a home for orphans, founded a relief organization called Raising Malawi Orphan Care Initiative, and as a personal example, she and her husband adopted a boy from Malawi, David Banda Mwale, whose mother had died. Now Madonna has written and produced I Am Because We Are, a documentary about Malawi that attempts to demonstrate the need for action by profiling 8 children growing up without parents. These youngsters long for a better life and strive to remain optimistic about the future despite the long odds fate has set against them. I Am Because We Are also features interviews with a number of people working to alleviate the ongoing tragedy in Malawi, including Bill Clinton, Bishop Desmond Tutu, Jeffrey Sachs, and leaders of a number of leading relief and charitable organizations. I Am Because We Are received its North American premiere at the 2008 Tribeca Film Festival. Okay. So, it's tragic that this is our starting point. This is not a uniquely African situation, but to make a conceptual distinction put forward by African musicologist Kofi Agau, it's a truly African situation. To clarify, the situation of millions of Africans and others around the world, children and adults who are subjected to manifold systemic assaults, is unjust and nakedly violent. I want to make a distinction between that violent and unjust state of affairs and the tragic. The tragedy is one that Frantz Fanon described as the condition of always arriving too late on a phenomenal stage that has already been set and perhaps even fixed by others. How, for instance, does the African philosopher think the situation of poor African children in a manner that's not predetermined, always already colonized, a priori given over to the emergence of particular noxious meanings? How does the African philosopher even engage in the abstract deliberation of Ubuntu, questions of African ethics, in a manner that's not fettered by Madonna, or the cultural and epistemic commodities into which Mandela and Tutu have been transformed? To take one example from among the best of us, I note the subtitles to Ochieng's books, Politics and Ethics at the Intersection of North Atlantic and African Philosophy, and the other, Knowledge and Aesthetics in North Atlantic and African Philosophy. Ochieng is cognizant of and intellectually honest about the North Atlantic ties that bind us. His stance reminds me of that judicious surgeon who decides that the parasite is too intricately embedded into vital tissue to allow for the possibility of surgical resection. It's a stand that calls for further sober consideration of Frantz Fanon's lament. This is my translation from the French. The maimed soldier from the Pacific War tells my brother, "Learn to live with your color as I am learning to live with my stump. We are both casualties. Learn to live with. Accommode-toi. Accommodate yourself. Accommodate yourself to your color. Yet with all my being, I refuse this amputation. I feel myself a soul as vast as the world, truly a soul deep as the deepest rivers, my chest a power of infinite expansion. I am gift, and they recommend to me the humility of the person with a disability." Now, the idea that humility, and I'm not saying that's what Fanon is saying, but the idea that humility is proper to someone with a disability is problematic and troubling. And I think it's worth thinking that alongside worth thinking what Fanon's putting forward, especially in light of this idea of the difficulty to think the African situation or condition apart from Madonna. Madonna standing in as a metonym for the North Atlantic world. Come to terms with the limitations that the world you inhabit circumscribe around black folk on one hand, or take yourself to be one capable of infinite expansion, a subject, an agent with the power to act within or even despite of what lines may be drawn out before you. These are the two poles along the axis on which we might think of the intertwining of African and North Atlantic that Ochieng highlights. Converted into a question, we might ask, given the world that she inhabits, one of whose signs is Madonna supposedly raising Malawi, the orphanage is called Raising Malawi, can the African be free? Put another way, Fanon once told his patients, it's necessary to go on. But what does that mean from an African vantage? What's the nature of this going on? Is a lot of the African, the manner by which the African can get on, is it resignation? Is it that letting go where one makes oneself pliant and thereby easily carried by the currents that sweep by? Is this how we ought to read Jennifer Makumbi's depiction of the situation of the Ugandan child? If you read just one novel this year, I highly, highly, highly recommend Kintu. From Kintu, Makumbi writes, Namata's parents were as ambitious as any Ganda commoners who had grown up under the British protectorate. You found yourself on earth without design on your part, and therefore there was no option but to grow up. Along the way, you found out there were 3 human species in the world and that you belonged to the worst. You were told that if you got baptized, then confirmed in church, you might have a chance. You got baptized in case the Europeans knew what they were talking about. Some children, mostly boys, had a stint in school. Royals, governors, and the children of proper Christians stayed on for a while. But commoners, royals, governors, and children of proper Christians stayed on, while for commoners, for whom school was a waste of time, the only thing left to do was to get married. A woman then dropped as many children as she was fated. Each child was born with its own particular luck. Parents showed their children the right way and watched as each child's destiny manifested depending on how the child interpreted the world. The I am because we are narrative is action-packed. Raising Africa, raising Malawi has to do with doing, with taking steps, with affecting change. Makumbi's depiction from her novel, Kintu, where Kintu is a Luganda word meaning thing. She called it Kintu thing rather than Muntu person. The person who's invoked in I am because we are. I am because we are is a bad translation of a Nguni proverb, common in lots of Southern Africa. The actual proverb is Umuntu ngubuntu ngabantu, which translates, a person is a person by virtue of, in concert with, among other people. Simplified into I am because we are. But it has to do with the achievement of personhood, with being a person. And it's interesting that Makumbi doesn't call her book Muntu, but Kintu. The focus isn't on person, but thing. The Rotten Tomatoes summary of Madonna's documentary takes personhood and the power to act for granted. Makumbi hesitates between thinghood and personhood. She puts personhood into question, perhaps casting it in terms of a quest. Where Madonna wants to raise Malawi, Makumbi notes that one finds oneself with no option but to grow up. There's a frightening congruity I find between these two accounts. You might recall Fanon's charge, the black was acted upon, values that were not engendered by his actions. Values not resulting from the systolic gush of his blood whirled around him in a colorful dance, Fanon said. This individual who was acted upon calls to mind Descartes' letter to Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, in which the former writes that the human soul can act and be acted upon by the body. Act and be acted upon is how Lisa Shapiro translates agir and pâtir, to act and to suffer. When Fanon says the black was acted upon, he says le noir a été agi. The word that he used for being acted upon, the grammatical sense of it is different to the grammatical sense of the manner in which Descartes says that the soul is acted upon. For Descartes, the soul for Descartes suffers, the body suffers the soul. The body allows itself to be acted on by the soul, but it allows itself to be acted on by the soul in a way that's active. There is a doing in the way in which the body allows the soul to act on it. The black, however, that Fanon talks about, is acted upon in a passive sense. The to be acted upon isn't an active thing, it's an allowing stuff to happen to the black. And I wonder if when Fanon picked that particular locution, when he chose that grammar to describe the situation of the black, I wonder if at some level, he was consciously making a contrast between the human soul that Descartes described and the souls of black folk, who Du Bois described. The black folk who are acted upon, who Fanon says are always too late, are those to whom freedom is given. They're granted entry into a closed civic space, one in which the black cannot alter fundamental structures. They can't move beyond the rail tracks already set for them. It's what Mukandi means by there being no is it what Mukandi means by there being no option but to grow up? Is this the Malawi which Madonna is supposedly raising? So I guess the question I'm asking is, do we have a situation in which for some people, and a situation that's truly an African situation, truly a black situation, but not uniquely so? But for some people, is it the case that you find yourself in a situation where you enter a world that's predetermined, where you can be acted upon, where you can move up and down a set of pre-established rail tracks, but you can't actually change the fundamental structures of that place? You can't lay your own tracks. And when this idea of raising Malawi, is this idea kind of congruous with that? Is raising Malawi an instantiation of that being acted on? That's the question. Movement, right, Suleiman Bashir Jian, which is a reality inscribed in cosmic incompletion itself, is also an ethical imperative that demands that each human creates a new situation, opening up new opportunities of self-creation in a continuous evolution that is ultimately the conquest of a life beyond death. There's an ethical imperative to move and to self-create, says Diane. However, Makumbi's account, and that of other African writers, Kamaralaye, Fiston Mujila, Noviolet Bulawayo, to name a few, their accounts point to movement as pragmatic, as imminent, as a factical imperative. Their account of movement is a movement that's necessitated by a set of conditions marked by existential incarceration rather than the power of self-creation. Every child was born with this particular luck, Makumbi tells us. Does the concession that parents watched each child's destiny manifesting, depending on how the child interpreted the world, does that allow for enough space to countenance the power of self-creation? Does the power of interpretation, the power of the mind, of thought, of reason, will, can this make for a crack through which one can exit the incarceration that's a certain kind of existential determinism? Patrick Chamwaso has written that true liberty may be just to have more intelligence than the stone that rolls down the path it's been set on. When that stone is African, is there available to us an intelligence that imbues one with power, which is to say the ability to act, to change course, to stop if one chooses. Now, I could be wrong, but I imagine that not many of you are familiar with Makumbi, with Laye, with Mujila, with Bulawayo. I imagine more of you will recognize the names David Simon and The Wire, though, right? Maybe, hopefully, generationally. In The Buys, the third episode of the first season of the now iconic television drama, one mid-level drug dealer decides to teach his two junior associates how to play chess. These are three black children playing, enjoying for a moment that trivial pursuits that most of us take to be proper to childhood, or coming as close as possible given the circumstances in which they're cast. They are three intelligent, clear-sighted children, ultimately grappling with questions of freedom and possibility. They understand that there's a determinism that rules over them, that is similar to that over the pawn, that rules even over the most powerful figures in their world, their kings and their queens. D'Angelo, depending on one's perspective, is a pessimist or a realist. He understands that the chess pieces are consigned to predetermined roles and set squares. Bodhi, like Shamwa So, ties freedom to intelligence. That intelligent pawn can become queen, and from his vantage, that constitutes escape, its victory, its self-creation, evolution, perhaps even freedom. This is what's available to the smart-ass pawn, according to Bodhi. So in this famous scene, Bodhi's like, wait, so you're telling me that if the pawn makes it to the 8th square, it can become the queen? And D'Angelo's like, yes. Bodhi's like, so all I need to do is be smart enough to get to the 8th square and I can be queen. D'Angelo's like, yes. And Bodhi sees in that escape. D'Angelo tells him, like, look, these pawns, a lot of them, they get capped quick. They die early. And he's like, yeah, but if you're smart, you can make it to row 8. Just before his death, though, Bodhi reflects back on this scene. And he realizes that for all the exercise of intellect and will, for all of his smarts and all of his heart, he recognizes that ultimately, he really is a pawn. But could it just be that Bodhi wasn't smart enough? Could it just be that he just didn't have enough intelligence to escape that determinism? Or could it be that David Simon is unduly pessimistic? And it's also worth thinking about the royals, governors, and children of proper Christians, whom Makumbi tells us are able to stay on at school. 3 of my grandparents grew up in what's now Zimbabwe and the 4th in Malawi. I stayed in school for so long that I ended up with a medical degree and a PhD, and I can come travel around the world and talk about works that move me. Surely I'm free, right? No? Maybe? One could argue for a reading of Ngugi wa Thiong's body of work as a series of rebellions against the imprisonment into which a European education cast him. He's also the African child to whom he refers in his Decolonizing the Mind, a title which you will notice, decolonizing, is cast in the present continuous tense. A title which might capture a similar kind of hope and investment into which Bodhi placed what lay at the 8th row of the chessboard. Ngugi wrote, "The language of the African child's formal education was foreign. The language of the books he read was foreign. The language of his conceptualization was foreign. Thought in him took the visible form of a foreign language. So the written language of a child's upbringing in the school, even a spoken language within the school compound, became divorced from his spoken language at home. This resulted in the dissociation of the sensibility of that child from his natural and social environment, what we might call colonial alienation. The alienation became reinforced in the teaching of history, geography, music, where bourgeois Europe became always the center of the universe." And what's so bad about that? Dambudzamara Chera says, this is where that education took him. It's like, when I talked was always in the form of an interminable argument, on one side of which was always expressed in English, and the other side always in Shona. At the same time, I would be aware of myself as something indistinct but separate from both cultures. I felt gagged by this absurd contest between Shona and English. I knew no other language. My French and Latin were enough to make me wary of conversing in them. However, some nights, I could feel the French and Latin fighting out in the shadowy background of the English and Shona. The fights completely muzzled me. The conversation, the arguments, the pleas steadily asserted their own independence. I wandered about, drugged to the hilt by tranquilizer and feeling literally robbed of words. Or, as Titidanga Rembo puts in nervous conditions, I was beginning to have a suspicion, no more than the seeds of a suspicion, that I had been too eager to leave the homestead and embrace the Englishness of the mission. And after that, the more concentrated Englishness of Sacred Heart. The suspicion remained for a few days, during which time it transformed itself into guilt, and then I had nightmares. I was young then and able to banish things, but seeds grow. Although I was not aware of it then, no longer could I accept Sacred Heart and what it represented as the sunrise of my horizon. Quietly, unobtrusively, extremely fitfully, something in my mind began to assert itself. To question things, to refuse to be brainwashed, bringing me to this time when I can set down the story. It was a long and painful process for me, the process of expansion. It was a process whose events stretched over many years. So in all these cases, this idea of being educated out of determinism, what we see is they have this effect. This education has this effect of kind of subjecting people into this North Atlantic world in a way that's alienating, that drives some of these characters to madness almost, or to the doors of madness. But Dangarembwa writes in the end about there being an expansion that happened. And that expansion is movement. Is that what self-creation looks like for the African child? Or is this strange, maddening education an example of a manifestation of a pawn moving down the chessboard? In The Black Insider, Marichera says that thoughts that think in straight lines can't see around corners. The missionaries and teachers saw to that. We were taught to want to go where straight lines go and look back over the shoulder to where straight lines come from. Like fugitives, prone to the dangers that accompany traveling in straight lines, let's double back. So let me share an anecdote. So years ago, I was teaching a Masters in Public Health course. And I gave a lecture on power. And I thought it went reasonably well. But afterwards, a really concerned looking Ugandan doctor came over to speak to me. And she sat me down. She's like, "Bryan, sit down." She's like, "Okay." We're like the same age, so I was confused. But she decided to be very kind of like, to be big sisterly to me. She's like, "Sit down." I was like, "All right, cool." And she's like, "Bryan, I'm worried about you." He's like, "Why are you worried?" It's like, all this thinking, Bryan, all this thinking, if you're not careful, it's going to harm you. Bad things are going to happen. I was like, I'm a philosopher. She's like, that's my point. All of this thinking, if you're not careful, bad things are going to happen. What did she mean? I mean, those literary accounts are of these African students who grapple with the contradictions of the disjuncture between the education and the world as they know it. They engage in all this thinking and it harms them. Yeah. Accommodate yourself, my Ugandan doctor sister was saying. Accommodate yourself to your situation. Stop trying to think so much about it. Learn to come to terms with the world as it is, with the chessboard and its rules as they stand, for your own sake. Accept your stump. African literature is replete with individuals who think themselves into madness. Read Angarembwa, Marachera Makumbi, Head, and many others. As Marachera writes in his semi-autobiographical The House of Hunger, some nights I could feel the French and Latin fighting in the shadowy backgrounds of the English and Shona. The fights completely muzzled me. The conversation, the arguments, and pleas steadily asserted their own independence. I wandered about, drugged to the hilt by tranquilizers and feeling literally robbed of words. That's when they began to laugh. Their laughter was of the crudest type, obscene. It reduced my whole world to a turd. Its stench got into my food, my painting, my reading, and my dreams. Everything I touched turned into a stinking horror. The historical figure, Dambuza Marachera, was really troubled. Thinking, which amounts to the failure of this African writer to accommodate himself to a situation, seems to have opened the door to madness. Whatever that might mean in the wake of Foucault and Derrida's rupture of the term. So I'm not claiming kind of like a simple, neat, clear understanding of what madness is, but whatever it is, thinking seems to have driven these people to that place. And while this madness of irreconciliation may again be a truly African phenomenon, it is not uniquely so. Think about D'Angelo. Think about the disjuncture for the African American, the Native American, the Latinx child who reads and takes seriously ideas about freedom and thinks about the material conditions that members of their community experience. Those things thought to their logical conclusion can lead to a maddening disjuncture. But, you know, just in case these seem like frivolous literary allusions, Descartes. Descartes is one of those figures who, like, you sprinkle some Descartes and then like, oh, okay, maybe he really is a philosopher. So, let's think of the second of Descartes' meditations. Balanced diet, the wire, Descartes. Let's think about the second of Descartes' meditations. Having summoned all of his intellect in the attempt to truly grasp what is, having doubted everything, and as a result, having lost ground, having stripped himself bare, René Descartes writes the following. It feels as if I have fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around, so that I can neither stand at the bottom nor swim up to the top. Nevertheless, I'll make an effort and once more attempt the same path. Our committees used to demand just one firm and immovable point in order to shift the entire earth. So I too can hope for great things if I manage to find just one thing, however slight, that is certain and unshakable. If you're not familiar with the meditations, Descartes decides, like, I want to distinguish between, I want to know what really is. I want to distinguish between conventional wisdom, things that are taken for granted, and what actually is. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to doubt everything. I'm going to doubt everything except what I can know clearly and distinctly. And having doubted everything, he comes to a point where it's like, what can I know? And it's like, I felt like I got to this point where it was crazy. Like, I felt like I was trapped in this whirlpool. In the French, It reads, I felt like I was trapped in this deep water, in the deep. Here's Descartes, either whirling around or in the deep. You can't, and what doubt has done, what this irreconciliation has done, means he can't find solid ground at the bottom. He can't swim up to the top and get out, and he's stuck and he's trapped. And it's terrifying. Irresolution, irreconciliation terrifies him. Despite the fact that Q. Lee does not interrogate this particular passage in a discussion of madness in her reading Descartes otherwise, she nevertheless claims that the loss of a grip on reality is the communicative frame of the meditations. It says that she asks, is the I self-identified as mad? Does Descartes at this point think that he himself is or could be mad? The answer is unavailable. Descartes neither negates nor affirms his own lunacy. This I is most vulnerable in the whirlpool, in the deep water, where the protagonist can either sink to the bottom and find solid ground on which to stand or swim to the surface. Yet Descartes' horror ends. Descartes is raised out of his indeterminacy and saved from the madness in a really peculiar way. He decides that the fact that I'm doubting means that I'm thinking. And thinking is indicative of the existence of an I doing the thinking. A lot of people will debate that, but this is what Descartes says. All of which is buttressed by the idea of God, who is good, perfect by definition, and therefore wouldn't lie to him. Ultimately, the meditations rest on the idea that there is a good God who wouldn't lie. And that's ultimately the foundation on which Descartes can establish what he takes to be clear and distinct ideas. Yet, as Paul Ricoeur points out, there is a transmutation by which the cogito passes from the second to the third mutation, whereby the apparent order in which what may have been appeared to be a self-positing I on whose basis God is deduced is reversed. The third meditation reverses the order by placing the certainty of the cogito in a subordinate position in relation to divine veracity. The idea of God is logically prior to the idea of the cogito. In English, when threatened by the madness of indeterminacy and irreconciliation, Descartes asserts God and grounds himself in God. At the heart of the meditations is an act of faith, disguised as the work of reason, satisfying skepticism. This act of faith is a display of power, the ability to put in place an anchor on which everything that is rests. It's the power to assert, to lay, to establish grounds. Furthermore, this power to summon God, which signifies in part the slippage whereby God and the modern I begin to meld, occurs in a particular historical-political context. I'll skip. Okay. Ignore Ricoeur. We'll skip him. The point I'm trying to make is, think about what it means to be able to summon God, to be able to deploy God to buttress your argument. This is an act of power. And it's an act of power that happens in a particular historical and political context. Yeah? The French, the Spanish, the Portuguese are out conquering the New World and subjugating people. Yeah. The same Geist. The same movement whereby a Descartes summons God, invokes God, grounds his intellectual project on God, is the one through which Europe, invoking God again, goes to places around the world and decides that they are going to remake those places in their own image and subsume the people them under them. Yeah? There is a relationship between the conquistadors and the modern I am. Now, and this is basically what the quotation from Dussel is saying. Dussel is pointing to the relationship between Cartesian certainty and European conquest in the 17th century on one hand, And think about the fact that this very spot, this place here, where we're having this conversation, it wasn't had events tied to European conquest not transpired, this place might be very different. The fact that this isn't a place at which Native American people engage in Native American practices, and instead is a place in which we're having this conversation, isn't unrelated to the same phenomenon. So, I guess, again, to repeat my question, does Amarachera or one of Makumbi's Ganda commoners, interpreting the world as best they can, do they have at their disposal the power to establish grounds or to contribute to this process of grounding that Descartes has? Or is our lot, those of us who constitute the other of those with the power to establish grounds, is our lot to do the best we can along the tracks that have been laid? There's an African philosopher, Jian, I'm sorry, we don't have too much further to go. Suleiman Bashir Jian responds with an emphatic no. He affirms that the movement of leaving our enclosures in the traditions of the fathers. Jian writes, the open is undetermined. Jian thinks about the 11th century Persian philosopher and physician, Ibn Sina, who is known in the Western world as Avicenna. To quote Jian on this pivotal figure in the history of philosophy, Jian writes, this master of Islamic peripatetism, a study of Aristotle, understood creation as a series of emanations through which the divine thought produced a succession of intelligences, from the first to the 10th, which is called the active intelligence. It is what illuminates human intelligence and actualizes our capacity to understand intelligible realities. As light actualizes our capacity to see sensible things. In other terms, thanks to the effusion of the active intelligence, divine as at its source, our intelligence is awakened from the passivity of its states of simple potentiality and so becomes active. I'm not saying that Jian is committed to this metaphysics, but his position is congruous with it. Human intelligence, according to Jian, is illuminated by divine intelligence, and in so doing is liberated from passivity. To quote him a little bit further, he says that human beings are the desire to realize themselves in the fullness that drives them towards the pleasure generated by the exercise of their highest faculty. Full pleasure and mixed is thus one provided by the intelligizing of intelligible things, by the search for it, the ascent towards oneself. It does not stop at this first level. The intellect, which is the center of our humanity, is also an openness to all of the intelligence that emanates from God, thanks to the meditation. Okay, I'll simplify. So, there's a tradition in Islamic philosophy, which is really similar to traditions in kind of Greek philosophy, that sees creation as that, for the Neoplatonists, the divine, like what the world is that there's God, and everything else is kind of like a reverberation of God. The rest of creation is kind of emanates from the divine. Yeah. There's a tradition in Islamic philosophy where how human intellect is sparked by divine intellect. And so what happens is the human turns to God because their perfection is in God. there is a desire of the human intellect to return to God, to return to the place from which it came. Yeah. And for Jian, and the really complex kind of philosophical position that he lays out, we're all free by virtue of the fact that we all have the spark of the divine that illuminates us. All of us have this thing inside of us that yearns for us to actualize, to be what we're supposed to be. None of us is determined. We all have the capacity to be who and what we truly are, which is a reflection of the divine intelligence. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think that's fantastic if you believe it. Yeah. But also, I think what I find really interesting is in the way that Descartes invokes God, and the invocation of God and the laying down of this is the ground on which the world is built. There's this really interesting parallel for Jian where salvation comes by turning to God. Like, God is the condition of possibility by which one can be freed from the way in which a person becomes something other than a stone that keeps rolling down the path it's being set is by the power of the divine. In a sense, then, liberty or freedom in a real sense, being something other than a chess piece on a chessboard, demands something miraculous. In the absence of the miraculous, that's what the person is. I don't know. Descartes invokes God in an exercise of power. Jian calls out to God in an exercise of faith. But is an exercise of faith not also an expenditure of power? Can the stone rolling along a path on which it's been set have the ability to grasp and respond to that divine spark? Can the stone rolling down the path on which it's being set, full of faith, having turned towards the divine, exercising faith, willing, applying reason and knowledge, asserting their personality and individuality, can that person, can that individual know whether or not, so say that person commits to freedom. Say that person decides, I am not going to be a pawn. And say they decide, I'll show you that I'm not a pawn. I'm going to tattoo myself. I am going to, I'm going to self-create visually on my own body. I am going to not dress in conformity with what's expected from me. I am not going to take the kind of job that's expected from me. I am going to become president, even though that's not expected of me. Can that person who achieves all these things, can that person know that those achievements are anything other than what's expected of them? Is one's rebellion, or what one takes to be rebellion, actually rebellion, or just the manifestation of the path that's laid out for them? Is there freedom for the stone that's rolling down? When it changes direction, has it changed direction because it's willed it, or it's changed direction in the manner that it was supposed to have changed direction? Does that question make sense? Let's skip some things. Last passage, nearly done. This is from, if you read 2 novels this year, I highly recommend Tram 83 as a second. It's brilliant. And this is long, but it's gorgeous. And I just ask that, as we read this, that you think about the Raising Madonna narrative. Sorry, the Raising Malawi narrative. Eyes shriveled by cigarettes and alcohol. Pot bellies full to bursting with roundworms, amoebas, earthworms, and assorted mollusks. Heads shaved with knives. arms and legs stiff with the digging graves from morning till morning. They were close to 10, maybe 12 years old. They touted the same justifications. We're doing this to pay for our studies. Dad's already gone with the locomotives. He doesn't write no more. Mom's sick. The uncles and aunts and grandparents say we're sorcerers and it's because of us that Dad got married a third time and that our sorcery comes from Mom and that we should go see the preachers who will cut the links by getting us to swallow palm oil to make us vomit up our sorcery and prevent us flying around at night. They lived off a multitude of rackets, like all the kids in town. They worked as porters at the Northern Station and on the Congo River and at the Central Market, as Slim Jims in the mine, errand boys at Tram 83, undertakers, grave diggers. The more sensitive ones stood guard at the greasy spoons abutting the stations, whose metal structures recalled the 1885s, in exchange for a bowl of badly boiled beans. He stopped, got out his notebook, wrote, childhood, 0 to 2 years old. Puberty, 3 to 7 years old. Adolescence, 8 to 12 years old. At 15, you're already scribbling your will. Now, I don't know what to make of Mujila's children other than to say that he snatched them from Madonna's grasp. I don't know whether their rackets constitute their liberty. Are these smart-ass pawns? And if so, what will be their end? Even if some make it to the 8th row of the board, will that constitute liberty or escape? But maybe I've been asking the wrong question. Maybe all of this has been me looking at things the wrong way. Maybe I should follow in James Baldwin's footsteps and instead direct my questions to those heirs of Descartes, those enjoying the fruits of the modern world whose conceptual ground he helped lay. In Baldwin's terms, those who take themselves to be white, who possess, as Cheryl Harris put it, that property that is whiteness. I mean, establishing an orphanage named Raising Malawi strikes me as a reinvestment in the Cartesian grounding enterprise. It's a capital injection into whiteness. Perhaps the more pressing question is not that of the lot of the African child, but that of the madness of whiteness. The madness of the investment in the repetition of laying down structures of dominance. Perhaps the question is whether or not whiteness can be helped. Whether or not there's hope for white people to be other than the stone that rolls down the path that is set. Could it be, and this is a genuine question, could it be that in African philosophical, literary, and artistic works, in the works of black folk the world over, and the works of others, that some might learn how to divest their whiteness in non-violent, non-appropriative ways? Who knows? Those Malawian children might save Madonna yet. Thank you.